Love or immigration? 3. The wedding ceremony was a nightmare for Farah. When it came time to repeat her vows, her throat closed up and she could barely speak. Not so with Ali. His voice rang out loud and clear, without the least hesitation. Love and cherish. Farah's conscience was screaming. She had no intention of loving Ali. She didn't want to love any man, because love had the power to hurt her, the power to break her. Farah had worked hard to blot it from her life. Love was superfluous, unnecessary, painful when abused, and her heart had yet to recover from her first experience with it. Signing the final documents was even worse than enduring the ceremony. Her hand trembled as she wrote her name on the marriage certificate. Her eyes glazed with tears as she stared at the official document, all too aware of the lie she was living. Salman, her assistant, and the minister all seemed unaware of her distress. She didn't know what Ali was thinking. His fingers pressed against the small of her back as though to encourage her. She continued to hold the pen and remained bent over the document long after she'd finished signing her name. "May your marriage be a long and fruitful one," the minister was saying to Ali. Farah squeezed her eyes shut, drew in a steadying breath and straightened. She dared not look at Ali for fear he could read her thoughts. Long and fruitful, Farah's mind echoed. A sob welled up inside her and she was afraid she'd burst into tears. This deception was so much more difficult than she'd ever imagined. "Shall we join the others?" Salman, who had served as Ali's best man, suggested, gesturing toward the door. Farah was grateful for an excuse to leave the room. The reception was being held in a large hotel suite across the hall from where the wedding had taken place. Their guests were helping themselves to a wide array of hors d'oeuvres served on silver platters, and crystal flutes of juices. Farah was surprised by how many people had come on such short notice. Most were business associates, but several family friends were also in attendance. She had few friends left, allowing the majority of her relationships to lapse after her father's death. Ali was at her side, smiling and cordially greeting their guests. He placed his arm casually around her shoulders. Farah stiffened at the unwelcome familiarity, but if he noted her uneasiness, he paid no heed. "Have I told you how beautiful you look?" he whispered close to her ear. Farah nodded. He hadn't been able to take his eyes off her from the moment she'd arrived in her wedding dress. Oddly, that depressed her, planning to deceive him the way she was. He was expecting more from this marriage than she was going to give him. She should have opted for the plain, simple, unadorned dress instead of the ornate one she'd chosen. The minute she'd viewed herself before the wedding, she was sorry she'd bought this gown. Even Salman had seemed dumbstruck when he went to escort her to Ali's side. He'd become especially maudlin with his compliments, which added to her stress and her guilt. "Could you pretend to love me?" Ali whispered. "Just for these few hours." His warm breath against her skin sent shivers down her spine. "Smile, my love." She complied obediently, her expression no doubt looking as stiff as it felt. Better, he murmured under his breath. How soon can we leave? Ali chuckled softly. I know you're eager for me, but if we left too soon, it would be unseemly. Farah's face burned with a wild blush, which appeared to amuse Ali even more. Would you like me to get you a plate? He offered. She shook her head. Food held no appeal. Do you want something? She asked. He turned to her, his eyes ablaze. Rest assured, I do, but I'll get my dessert later. Farah didn't think her knees would support her much longer. From obligation more than desire. She drank a glass of juices. It must have been more potent than she realized because she felt giddy and light-headed afterward. It was the dress, she decided. She wanted to change out of the wedding gown because it made her feel things she had no right to feel. With Ali standing at her side, she felt beautiful and wanted. And loved when she didn't deserve or want any of it. She'd gone into this marriage for all the wrong reasons. She was uncomfortable, using Ali for her own gain, giving nothing of herself in return. Until she'd stood before the preacher, marriage had been little more than a concept, an idea she didn't believe in. She hadn't expected a few words mumbled before a man of God to be so powerful. But she'd been wrong. Farah was shaken and uncertain afterward, as if she was mocking important human values. Salman. She reached out to her brother and clasped his arm with both hands. I've got to get out of here. He must have read the desperation in her eyes, because he nodded gravely. Whatever he said to Ali, Farah didn't hear. She assumed her brother would escort her from the room, but it was Ali who slipped his arm around her waist. It was her husband who led her out of the reception. Salman is making our excuses, he explained. She nodded. I'm sorry, she whispered as he took her down the hallway to the changing room. I don't know what happened. Are you feeling faint? I'm fine now, thanks. Or she would be, once she was out of this dress and back in her own clothes. And once he removed his arm from her waist, the walls seemed to close in around her. She wished Ali would leave her, but he stayed even when she reached the door leading to the changing room. We didn't kiss, Ali whispered. Not properly. Farah didn't bother to pretend she didn't know what he was talking about. When Ali was told to kiss his bride, Farah had made sure he'd merely given her a peck on the cheek. Ali had been disappointed, and Salman's eyes had revealed his frustration. A passionate kiss would have put the stamp of credibility on their act. You're not sick, are you? She could have lied, could have offered him countless excuses, but she didn't. I'm fine, she said, just as she had a minute earlier. Then I'll kiss my bride. Her first instinct was to put him off, to thwart him again, but a kiss seemed like such a simple way to ease her conscience. His touch had always been tender, as if he understood and appreciated her need for gentleness. Yes, she agreed breathlessly. Her back was against the wall and his arms went around her waist. Unsure what to do with her own hands, she splayed them across his chest. He pulled her against him, and for a long moment he held her, as if savoring the feel of her in his arms. The trembling returned and Farah closed her eyes. She could smell his cologne, feel his heart beat beneath her flattened palms. His breath echoed in her ears and rustled her hair. His mouth met hers. His touch was light and brief. She tipped her head back and her eyes drifted shut as his mouth brushed hers again and again. A sigh worked its way through her as his tongue outlined the shape of her mouth. After a series of nibbling kisses, he caught her lower lip between his teeth. Farah held her breath, unable to respond. She was content to let him be the aggressor, to allow him to touch her and kiss her without fully participating herself. But her lack of involvement obviously bothered Ali. "Farah," he pleaded, "kiss me back." Tentatively, shyly, her mouth opened to him and he moaned, then deepened the kiss. His arms tightened their hold and he slanted his mouth over hers. Strange, unwelcome pleasure rippled through her body. She sighed at the sensations she experienced, she couldn't help it. She felt hot and shaky, as though she'd suffered a near miss, as though she'd stepped off a curb and felt the rush of a car passing by and come within inches of being struck. Her hands, which had seemed so useless moments before, were buried in his dark hair. Her body, so long untouched, felt about to explode. She moved against him, clinging to him, fighting back tears. The sound of someone clearing his throat broke the spell. Ali stilled, as did Farah. Slowly, reluctantly, she opened her eyes to find half of the reception guests lined up in the hall watching them. Salman stood in the background, smiling broadly. He gave her a thumbs up, looking ecstatic. If they were hoping to fool their guests, they'd succeeded beyond her brother's expectations. As though loath to do it, Ali released her. He seemed perturbed by the interruption and muttered something she didn't understand. "I'll change clothes," she said, hurriedly moving into the room. She was grateful there was a chair. Sinking down onto it, she pressed her hands to her red face and closed her eyes. She felt as if she'd leapt off a precipice in the dark and had no idea of where she'd be landing. A kiss that had begun as a compromise had become something else. She'd been trying to soothe her conscience, but instead had added to her growing list of offenses, leading Ali to believe he should expect more. Farah took her time changing. 15 minutes later she reappeared in a bright red flowered dress she'd found in the back of her closet. These days she dressed mostly in business suits, jackets, straight skirts and plain white blouses. The dress was a leftover from her college days. The design was simple and stylish. Ali was pacing the hallway anxiously. "I'm sorry I took so long." His smile was enthusiastic. He touched her lips, still swollen from his kiss. The color hadn't faded from her cheeks, either, if anything, it had deepened with this fresh appraisal. "I promised my grandmother we'd stop in at the hospital after the reception," Farah said nervously. "I'd hate to disappoint her." "By all means we will see her." They said their farewells and left the reception. Farah knew the minute they walked into Nadia's hospital room that she'd been waiting for them. Her grandmother's smile was filled with love as she held her hands out to them. Farah rushed forward and hugged her. She was reminded each and every time she saw her grandmother that Natia was close to death. She clung to life, not for herself, but for Farah's sake. It hurt her to know Natia was in pain. Why did those who were good always have to suffer? Why couldn't God spare her grandmother just a few more years? This day, her wedding day, had started a cauldron of emotions churning in her mind. She couldn't bear to think of what her life would be like without her grandmother. It had been Natia's kindness that had gotten her through Nasir's deception and her father's death. Otherwise, Farah feared she would have ended up in a mental ward. Other emotions long buried and ignored came to the surface, as well. Kissing Ali had stirred up needs and desires she'd assumed were lost to her. There were no answers, at least none she felt confident enough to face. Only myriad questions that assailed her on every front. She couldn't trust herself, her power to discern had been sadly lacking once and had cost her and her family dearly. She dared not trust herself a second time. She was married to a man she didn't love, a man who didn't love her, either. To complicate everything, her grandmother was dying. This was what her life had come down to. A loveless marriage and a desperate loneliness. When Farah released her grandmother, Natia looked up and brushed the tears from Farah's cheeks. "You're crying?" she asked softly. "This should be the happiest day of your life." Ali placed his arm around Farah's waist and helped her into the chair next to the bed. He stood behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. Farah pressed Natia's hand to her cheek and held it there. Her grandmother seemed much weaker today. "I remember when I married Abid," she said with a wistful smile. Her grandfather had been dead many years now. He was only a vague memory to Farah, who guessed she'd been about 7 or 8 when he died. "I was frightened out of my wits." Frightened? Farah didn't understand. "I wondered if I was doing the right thing." There were very few divorces in those days, and if a woman happened to marry the wrong man, she was often sentenced to a miserable life. "But I thought you'd known him for a long time." Natia arched one delicate brow. "A long time," she repeated. "In a manner of speaking, you're right. But we'd only gone out on a handful of dates before we were married. I'd always assumed you knew Grandpa for years." Natia's hand stroked Farah's cheek. "It's true that in the early days Abid worked for my father at the paint company my family owned. I'd see him now and then when I dropped in at the office, but those times were rare." Farah was enthralled. She knew her grandmother had deeply loved her grandfather, but she couldn't remember ever hearing the story of their courtship. "When did you fall in love?" "Abid stopped working for my father, and Dad was furious with him. They were both strong-willed men and it seemed they were constantly disagreeing. Abid started his own business in direct competition with my family's." She smiled whimsically. It was a bold move in those depression years, before the war. He managed to keep his head above water, which infuriated my father even more. I think at that point Dad would have taken pleasure in seeing Abid fail. She paused and closed her eyes for a moment, as though to gather her strength. Then the war came and Abid joined the army. Before he left for England he came to the house. I thought he was there to see my father. Can you imagine my surprise when he said I was the one he'd come to see? He told me he was going overseas and he asked if I'd be willing to write him. Naturally, I told him I would be, and then he did the strangest thing. When Natia didn't immediately continue, Farah prompted her. What did he do? Natia shook her head. It was such a little thing and so very sweet, so much like Abid. He took my hand and kissed it. Her grandmother's gaze fell to her hand, as if she still felt the imprint of his lips. As I look back on it, Natia went on, I realize that was when I lost my heart to Abid. You see, I don't believe he ever expected to return from the war. He loved me then, he told me much later, and had for a long time, but Abid was afraid Dad would never approve of him as my husband. How long was he away? I didn't see him for 3 years, although I heard from him regularly. I treasured his letters and reread them so often I nearly wore them out. By the time he came home I was so deeply in love with him, nothing else mattered. My family knew how I felt and I feared the worst when Dad insisted on accompanying me to meet Abid's train. What happened? Natia's smile was weak, but happy. Dad offered to merge his business with Abid's. Even though Abid himself had been away, his small company had survived the war. Abid accepted, with the stipulation that both the company and I take on his name. She smiled again. It was a unique proposal. My father agreed without much hesitation and I agreed with none at all. We were married. Less than a month later. What a beautiful story, Farah whispered. We had a wonderful life together, better than I dared dream. I'll never stop missing him. Farah knew her grandmother had taken Abid's death hard. For a long while afterward, she'd closed herself off from life. It was in those bleak years that Farah's father had wisely sent Farah and Salman to spend the summers with their grandmother. You, my children, Natia continued, turning to Ali, will have a good life, too. Ali, be gentle with my lamb. Her heart's been bruised, and she can be a bit prickly, but all she needs is love and patience. Grandma. Natia chuckled and gestured with her hand. Off with you now. You don't want to spend your wedding night with me. I love you, Farah murmured as Natia settled back against the pillows. Have a good sleep, and I'll call you in the morning. It was a privilege to spend this time with you, Ali said. Reaching for her grandmother's hand, he bent down and kissed it. I would have liked your Abid, he told her. He was a rare man of honor. A smile coaxed up the corners of Natia's mouth. Indeed he was. When we first married, there was talk, there always seemed to be talk. Some folks said Abid had married me for my connections. For the money I would one day inherit. Few realized the Natia. I was the fortunate one to be loved by such a man. Farah looked at Ali, but when their eyes met, she quickly glanced away. Now go, Natia urged. This is your wedding night. The words echoed in Farah's ears. Her grandfather had been a man of honor, but she clearly hadn't inherited his grit or his honesty. She planned to cheat Ali and he was about to learn exactly how much. Farah had surprised him. Ali had misjudged this woman who was now his wife. For 2 years, he'd studied her, astonished by her tenacity. Salman had told him little of what had led to the company's financial problems. Ever since his arrival, he'd picked up bits and pieces of what had happened, but no one had explained the events that had brought near ruin. From what he understood, Chaudhry Industries had come very close to introducing a long-lasting exterior paint with a 25-year guarantee. Jerome Chaudhry, Salman and Farah's father, had been a chemist, too, and he'd been personally involved in developing it. The company was on the brink of making one of the most innovative and progressive advances in the industry. This high-tech development was expected to have a dynamic impact on sales and give Chaudhry Industries a badly needed financial boost. The company had been set for expansion, confident of success. Then a series of mishaps occurred. This was the part that remained vague to Ali. He'd heard something about a burglary and a defection to a rival company. But by far the worst was a huge fire that had destroyed the lab and the warehouse. Not until much later had they learned the fire was arson. An employee was suspected. That much he'd been told by Salman. But there wasn't enough proof to prosecute whoever it had been. Shortly after the fire, Salman and Farah's father had suffered a heart attack and died. It was then that Farah had taken over the company. They'd struggled for a year, trying to recover lost ground, before Salman made the arrangements to bring Ali from Iraq. Since that time, he'd been working hard on implementing his ideas. "You're very quiet," Farah commented, breaking into his thoughts. He glanced over at his bride. Her nervousness didn't escape him. He wanted to do whatever was necessary to put her at ease. He'd enjoyed listening to the story of Natia and Abid Chaudhry's love. It had touched his heart, reminding him of his own grandparents, long dead. They'd loved each other deeply and he could have asked for no finer heritage. His grandfather had died first and his grandmother had followed less than a year later. His mother claimed her mother-in-law had succumbed to a broken heart. Farah shifted restlessly in the car. He caught the movement from the corner of his eye and wondered about this woman he'd begun to love. He'd been observing her for 2 years, he knew her far better than she could possibly grasp. And he'd known the instant Salman had suggested they marry that he would accept nothing less than total commitment from her. He was not a man who did things by half measures. He looked forward to the time he would sleep with his wife. He'd sensed fire in her, but hadn't realized how hot the flames were until they'd kissed. Really kissed. No woman had ever affected him as strongly as Farah. The kisses had enhanced his appetite for what was to follow. He would be patient with her, careful and slow. Although every instinct insisted he'd take her to his bed now, do away with her fretting and worries so they could enjoy the rest of the evening together. He must be patient, he reminded himself. Where would you like to go for dinner? He asked. He suggested a couple of his favorite restaurants. Dinner, she echoed, as though she hadn't given the matter a second thought. I don't know. You decide. Would you mind if we went to our condo? In one of their few practical conversations, they'd agreed that he'd move into her place. His own apartment had been a furnished rental, so there hadn't been much to bring over, just books, his computer, clothes, and a few personal effects. He had a small moving company take care of it and continued to pay rent on the place so his sister, Tahira, could eventually move in there. Ali's nod was eager. She would relax there, and what was the Pakistani term, unwind? Yes. She would unwind so that when the time came for them to retreat to the bedroom, she'd be warm with drink and eager for his touch. We'll have to send out for something, Farah announced when they reached the high-rise condominium. It was situated in the heart of downtown Karachi on the 10th floor, overlooking Puget Sound. A white and green ferry could be seen in the distance. The jagged peaks of the Olympic Mountains rose majestically to the west. The day had been clear and bright, but now the sun was setting, casting a pink glow over the landscape. Send out, he repeated, frowning. Farah stood in the middle of her modern home and clasped her hands in front of her. I don't cook much. Ah. Now he understood. I am excellent in the kitchen. In the bedroom, too, but he couldn't say that without embarrassing her. She would learn that soon enough. You want to make our dinner? Yes, he answered, pulling his attention from the magnificent view and following her into the kitchen. He liked her home. The living room was long and narrow with windows that extended the full length. The dining room and kitchen were both compact, as if their importance was minimal. Would you like a glass of white drink? Farah asked him. Please. While she was busy with the drink, he explored his new home. A narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms. The larger was dominated by a king-size bed, covered with a bright blue comforter, and what seemed like 100 small pillows. The scent of flowers, violets he guessed, hung in the air. The second bedroom was much smaller and the closet was filled with boxes. A quick examination revealed Christmas decorations. He returned to the kitchen and took the drink glass from his wife's hand. Her eyes, so large and dark, appealed to him, but for what he wasn't sure. One thing was certain, Ali knew he couldn't wait much longer to make love to her. Farah felt like a fox about to be released for the hunt. She would soon be cornered, trapped by her own lies. Ali didn't realize, at least not yet, that she had no intention of sleeping with him. So far, he'd been patient and kind, but she couldn't count on his goodwill lasting. I found a couple of chicken breasts in the freezer, she told him. She felt as though she was in danger of swallowing her heart. She was pretending for all she was worth, acting the role of devoted wife, when she was anything but. I'll make a salad. He was searching through her drawers, stopping when he came across an old cloth dish towel. He tucked it at his waist and continued to survey her cupboards, taking out a series of ingredients. He'd chopped an onion, a green pepper and several mushrooms by the time she dragged a stool to the counter. Perhaps she'd learned something about cooking from him. She'd seen Ali working in the laboratory. But now he astonished her with the familiar way he moved about her kitchen, as if this was truly his second home. When did you learn to cook? As a boy. My mother insisted and I enjoy it. Thank her for me. Ali paused and, glancing her way, smiled. You can do that yourself someday. I'm doing what I can to arrange for her immigration to the Pakistan. If there's anything I can do, please let me know. He nodded, seemingly pleased by her offer. Farah drank her drink and refilled both their glasses. Her mind was working at a frantic pace, devising ways of delaying the inevitable moment when he'd learn the Natia. Her original plan had been to get him drunk. 2 glasses of drink and she was feeling lightheaded and a bit tipsy. Ali had consumed the same amount and was completely sober. He wielded a large knife without the slightest hesitation. Her next thought was to appeal to his sense of honor. A strange tactic, she had to admit, coming from a woman who planned on cheating him out of an intimate relationship. He must recognize that she didn't love him. This was a business arrangement that profited them both, turning it into something personal could ruin everything. The kiss. She must have been mad to let him kiss her like that. She'd done nothing to resist him. Instead she'd encouraged him, led him to believe she welcomed his touch. She'd been shaken afterward. It shouldn't have happened. The very fact that she'd permitted him to hold her and touch her in such an intimate manner defeated her own purpose. Anger rose within her. Not at Ali, but at herself for having let things go so far. Now he expected more, and she wouldn't allow it. She was angry, too, about the enjoyment she'd found in his arms. It was as if she'd been looking for a way to prove herself as a woman, to show him and everyone else that she was more feminine than they'd suspected. Her foolishness had only complicated an already difficult situation. More drink? She asked nervously. The rice was cooking in a covered pot and the chicken was simmering in a delicious-smelling sauce. Ali appeared relaxed and at ease while Farah calculated how many steps it would take to reach the front door. Ali shook his head. No more drink for me. I'll set the table, she said, slipping down from the stool and moving into the dining room. Soon he'd know. Soon he'd discover what a phony she was. He'd learn that she was a liar and a cheat and a coward. Her hands were trembling as she set the silverware on the table. She added water glasses. Anything to delay returning to the kitchen. To Ali. He'd filled up their plates when she walked back into the room. Farah didn't know if she could eat a single bite, and she watched transfixed as he carried their meal into the dining room. Farah, my love. I'm not your love, she told him coolly, leaning back against the kitchen counter. His grin was slow. Undisturbed. Not yet, perhaps, but you will be. She closed her eyes, afraid to imagine what might come next. "Let us eat," Ali said, taking her unresisting hand and leading her to a chair. With impeccable manners, he held it out for her, then seated himself. "This is very nice," she said. The smells were heavenly. In other circumstances she would have appreciated his culinary skills. "My sister is an excellent cook," he said casually. He removed the linen napkin from the table and spread it across his lap. "If you agree, she will prepare our meals once she arrives from Iraq. She'll welcome the job and it'll simplify her receiving a visa." Of course Farah was more than willing to be generous with his family. "You are nervous?" Ali asked, after several bites. Farah hadn't managed even one taste. "Yes." He grinned. "Understandably. Don't worry, I will be gentle with you." Farah's heart plummeted. "I admire you, Farah. It isn't any woman who would accept the terms of our marriage. You are brave as well as beautiful. I feel fortunate to have married you."